In this video, we're going to be discussing what to look for in a used diesel engine. Might want to think twice about getting this one. Hey guys, Josh with the Adept Ape channel, and in this video we're going to be discussing a subject that I get questions, comments, and emails on all the time, and that is, hey, what do I need to look for in this piece of equipment, truck, RV, bus that I'll be purchasing that has a diesel engine? What do I need to look for in that engine to ensure it's not going to cost me a lot of money down the road? Now, before we start this video, disclaimer, any piece of equipment, any truck, bus with a diesel engine, there's nothing to say that you're going to get it 10 miles down the road, it's not going to eat a valve or throw a rod or have some sort of catastrophic electrical failure. Nothing you can do about that. But what we're trying to avoid is you buying something that's been abused or has a current problem that maybe the owner's trying to hide or doesn't know about and can cost you a lot of money down the road. Now, why am I not talking about the entire truck? The transmission, the wheels, the hubs, all that. Why am I focusing on the engine? Well, for two reasons. One is the engine's the most complicated and most costly piece on this piece of equipment. And by judging how the engine's been maintained, usually you can tell how the rest of the vehicle has been maintained, okay? So that's why we're going to be focusing on the engine here. Not only that, if you wanted to talk about everything on a truck or a piece of equipment, the video series would be really, really long, and I'm just trying to focus on the engine here, okay? So let's get into the video. So if you're trying to make a checklist on your diesel engine that you be potentially purchasing, and you kind of want to go through each individual component, the way I'm going to lay it out is kind of by symptoms that would cause you to want to dig a little further into it. So we'll need to talk about fluids, we'll need to talk about smoke, check engine lights, things like that. So first thing I want to focus on is smoke. And the reason for that is it's obviously the easiest to see, and there's not a lot of inspecting you need to do to see that, hey, why is there white smoke coming out of the exhaust pipe or the blow-by tube if it has one? So let's get into smoke and what you need to look for, what's normal, what's not normal, what you really need to be concerned about, okay? Now, irregardless of what make or model engine, diesel engine you have, it's going to have an exhaust system, and that exhaust system should be blowing only clear exhaust fumes. You don't want to see any colored smoke coming out of there. We don't mean bluish, white, black, green. Anything weird coming out of there is a potential problem that could cost you a lot of money. Now, the one exception to that is 2006 and older engines under acceleration or if revved up are almost always going to have a small amount of black smoke coming out of them. Now, maybe the previous owner has modified the injectors or the pump timing and it's creating more black smoke than normal. That's not necessarily a good thing, but that might be a modification. That doesn't indicate a problem with the engine. Now, what's excessive? Well, if it doesn't clear up right away, it's probably it's indicative of a problem with the engine. I'm talking black smoke here. Now, why the year designation of 2006 to 2007? Well, pretty much all on-highway diesel engines, that'd be in your RV, in a truck or a bus, 2007 or newer, are going to have something called a DPF, a diesel particulate filter. And the DPF's job is to catch black smoke, which is particulate, a carbon residue from combustion, and it's supposed to not allow it to pass out of the exhaust stack. Now, if you're, say, looking at a 2010 RV that has a DPF and under acceleration, you're seeing a lot of black smoke or even just a small amount, something's wrong with that system. Now, older DPFs sometimes will pass a little bit of soot, but if you're seeing a lot, there's something wrong. Either the DPF's failed or someone's modified the DPF, hollowed it out. It could be cracked. You could have a problem with an injector or some other fuel-related item, even a boost-related item that's causing excessive black smoke. That's a problem. DPFs are extremely expensive. So if you're looking at a newer vehicle with a DPF and you see black smoke, you really want to have that checked out because it could cost you thousands of dollars. Okay, let's talk about the other colored smokes here. So white, bluish, or green, all those are bad. And depending on which one, usually white's the other most heavily found one, is you probably have either coolant, fuel, or oil getting into your exhaust system. And those are never a good sign. So if you have coolant getting into your exhaust system, that means you probably have a cylinder head that's cracked, an EGR cooler that's cracked or leaking, a cracked cylinder head. There's a lot of potential problems there. If you see white smoke, I would say definitely want to have it checked out further before buying a vehicle that's emitting any sort of non-black smoke out of the exhaust system. Now, what about other types of smoke? Now you might be wondering, what other types of smoke would there be? Well, most older diesel engines, we're talking 2006 and older, which still plenty on the road, are going to have a blow-by tube. And on older cars, this would have been called a road draft tube, and some manufacturers still call them that. But what this is crankcase fumes that are basically combustion byproducts that push past the rings during combustion, and it's a normal process. All engines have this. On the newer engines, though, it's usually in a closed-loop system where the blow-by fumes are getting reintroduced into either the exhaust or the intake, and they're trying to burn them or filter them out. But on an older one, you can usually see the volume, and if the volume's very high or it looks high to you, that can be a bad sign. That can mean that you have excessive wear in the engine. Now, this could be caused by many things: air compressor, cylinder wear, valve seals, the turbocharger, but usually the number one cause is cylinder wear. So if you have large amounts of blow-by, at least visually, you probably want to dig deeper into that. Most dealerships can do what they call a blow-by test, which will measure the volume of the blow-by. And if it's excessive, you're probably dealing with a worn engine. Although there is a possibility it might just be an air compressor or a turbocharger. But all those items are expensive. Of course, the rebuild in a worn engine being the most expensive. So look out for blow-by on older engines. It's harder to tell on the newer engines with the closed crankcase systems, but if they have excessive blow-by, they're probably going to be getting a code, which will be excessive crankcase pressure or high crankcase pressure, because the system will be not able to deal with the large amounts of blow-by in the crankcase, and they'll be throwing some sort of check engine light. So check out for those check engine lights, but I'll be talking about more of those in the future in this video, okay? So moving on from our fumes, we want to be talking about fluids. And there's really two fluids you need to concern yourself with in an engine. That is your coolant and your oil. Now, the coolant, not quite as critical, and there's not as much you can test for. There are actually coolant samples you can take, and mostly they're going to tell you the additive concentration and the concentration of water to coolant. But outside of that, they're not going to tell you a lot of internal engine problems, unless, of course, there's a ton of metal or dirt or something in the coolant. But really, we're going to be focusing more on the oil. Now, there are oil sample kits, and they're relatively inexpensive. Most dealerships will have them regardless of manufacturer. Some places will do a quick analysis where they can tell you right away, or you can purchase a small vial and pull an oil sample yourself and send it in, and within a few days, you can have an analysis done that will tell you, is there fuel dilution in the oil? Is there coolant in the oil? What is the metal content of the oil? Of course, the metal, there's going to be some metal in all oil, but this will tell you if there seems to be excessive. And anything outside of the normal range is usually an indicator of either poor maintenance or an engine problem. Let's say it shows high fuel dilution. Well, that could mean you have an injector that is leaking fuel into the engine, which maybe an injector is not that expensive, but if the fuel dilution is high enough, that means the oil viscosity has been decreased because fuel is very light oil, and that can actually damage your bearings. So you might see higher metal concentrations if it has high fuel dilution. Coolant in the oil is very bad as well. That could indicate a cracked head, a bad head gasket, bad EGR cooler. There's a lot of things to look for there. But if you're not going to take a sample, there's other things you can look for yourself. You can look at the oil itself. Now, most diesels, the oil is going to be pretty black. That's just normal. If you've never looked at a diesel engine, you pull the dipstick, and it has 2,000 miles since the last oil change, the oil is probably going to be fairly dark. Some exceptions to that, but most diesel engines are going to have black oil. after a few thousand miles. Now, other than the oil just being black, you need to look at the condition of the oil. Now, what do I mean by that? If you're wearing gloves, you can rub the oil between your fingertips. You can do this without gloves, of course, but it should be slightly tacky. As you separate the oil between your finger and your thumb, it should stick a little bit. If it doesn't, that could indicate fuel dilution. Without getting a sample, that's a good way to tell. You can smell the oil. You would be looking for any sort of weird, like, coolant scents. Normally, coolant in the oil in high enough concentrations will turn the oil it's kind of a grayish mayonnaise color. Also, rust on the dipstick tube is an indicator that you've had moisture, usually coolant, in the crankcase or currently evident in the crankcase, and that's bad. That can mean really big, expensive repairs. So check for rust on the dipstick tube. Outside of that, there's not a lot you can look for in the oil itself just by looking at it. So I recommend an oil analysis if the current owner will let you pull one. If he won't, maybe he's trying to hide something, or maybe he doesn't want to wait a week for you to get your oil sample back, okay? So moving on from your fluids, you want to do a visual inspection of the engine itself. Now, you're most likely not going to see any mechanical damage to the engine, but you do want to look for signs of it. You don't want to see any patch jobs to the block or the head, as far as like someone maybe put JB Weld on any components, or some has mismatched paint over certain parts that can indicate maybe not the best repair to something. And I've seen a lot of blocks and heads and aluminum components that have had some sort of JB Weld done to them, oil pans as well. That can indicate a previous failure and not a good repair job done to it. But those are relatively rare. Usually what you're looking for is leaks. And what I mean by leaks is coolant, exhaust, and oil leaks. Now, coolant leaks, of course, mostly hoses, but you might see, let's say you can see a coolant stream or evidence of a coolant stream out of an exhaust port. That's a bad sign. That could mean, of course, you have a coolant leak in a cracked head, or an EGR cooler, or a head gasket, or an oil leak, rear structure on the block, or the block and the rear structure. That could be bad. That's a really expensive fix on any engine because you're going to have to pull the transmission and pull the rear structure. Now, most older diesel engines are going to have some sort of evidence of oil weeping past a seal or a sealant. And just because there's a little bit of black soot or black oil residue on a seam, if it's not wet or dripping, not really a huge reason to be concerned about it, especially on large seams such as the structures or the head to the block. But just to let you know, of course, there shouldn't be any there. It's just older diesels typically have some sort of oil residue somewhere on them. If it's not dripping, though, wouldn't really constitute a leak. Now, of course, hoses, things like that, those are relatively cheap, easy to fix as far as coolant leaks. Now, the other one you need to look for is exhaust leaks. And these can be hard to find sometimes because the exhaust leak won't typically show itself on the exhaust manifold or the turbocharger because the carbon that leaks out of the exhaust is going to burn off of those components because they're so hot. So what you're going to be looking for is on the head or the block by the exhaust, any sort of black soot. Not oily black soot, but just it almost looks burned. That will indicate an exhaust leak. And even though an exhaust leak is usually just the gasket's blown out, the gasket usually blows out because you have a fastener fail. Now, you might have a broken stud or exhaust bolt in the head or the turbocharger, and if you can't get it out, you might have to buy a new cylinder head or a new turbocharger or a new exhaust manifold. You're talking thousands of dollars, especially if it's the head, if those components cannot be properly repaired with a new fastener, depending on what's broken, of course. Now, the next step, of course, is to run the engine. And you might want to say, oh, well, you need to listen to the engine. Yes, you do need to listen to the engine. The problem with diesels, of course, is they're very loud, and depending on what model you're looking at, there's, of course, hundreds of different types. They can sound like they either have a valve failure or a loud fuel knock. It might be normal, unless you're used to certain engines. Cat 3126, when cold under acceleration, seems to have a loud fuel knock. That's almost inherent to the engine. It doesn't mean there's a problem with it. So, and lots of people don't even hear if there is a problem because they're not used to what that engine sounds like when it's normally running. I've had many drivers come in with low power complaints, and they have one or more multiple dead cylinders, and they didn't even know it, and they're in these trucks all the time. Unless you're attuned to listening to a certain model diesel engine, it's really hard to tell just by listening, of course, what it's supposed to sound like. Now, of course, any sort of loud knocking that's constant and seems to increase with RPM, that's usually a bad sign. Ticking and tapping, unless it's really loud and seems to be concentrated to one part of the engine, also not usually a good sign. But usually we need to test by performance of the engine, not just by what you think might be a problem. So, of course, you want to run the engine, you want to look at it, and you want to inspect it when it's cold and when it's hot, because maybe there's a problem that when it gets hot, it has a worse leak or a coolant leak, or maybe when it's cold, it has a coolant leak, not when it's hot. There's a lot of things to check for. You want to put the engine under a load as well. Now, what do I mean by that? Heavy acceleration, or if it's a machine, move some dirt. You want to see what the boost is. Boost is the number one best indicator of the performance of the engine. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have weak injectors, or a turbocharger leak, or the timing's off for some reason, any of those are going to cause lower than normal boost. Now, you might say, well, what's normal boost? Well, that really depends on the engine. You need to find someone that knows that engine and can then ask them, hey, this 5.9 Cummins, what's normal boost under full load? They would know. Or you can look up in some sort of specification book what normal boost is. If it's really low, you have a problem, and that could be maybe a quick fix like a CAC boot, or it could be very expensive. You also need to look at coolant temp. Is this thing getting hot? Or maybe it never gets hot because there's no thermostat in it, or the thermostat's stuck open. What's the oil pressure? Oil pressures can vary widely as well on certain engines. C12 Cat can idle at 15 psi. That's actually fairly normal. That is above the specification for minimum oil pressure for that. But on a C15, that would be below it. So you need to know what your particular engine is. And, if oil pressure seems low to you, check on it. That would be another good reason to get an oil sample done. Outside of that, check engine lights. Let's talk about them. I'm going to have a blanket statement that you should not buy a diesel engine that has an active check engine light without at least having it checked out by someone that really knows what they're talking about. And the reason for that is, let's say you have some sort of sensor fault, like a coolant fault. That could be just the sensor, or it could be the external harness, or it could be the ECM, or it could be an indication that the water pump's bad and it's not flowing coolant, or maybe something's wrong with the radiator itself or the fan. There's a lot of things to check for if there's an active code. So if there is an active code, you definitely want to get it checked out, I would say by the dealer, but maybe there isn't a dealer where you're at. If you know a reputable diesel mechanic that knows that particular engine, they can look at it. And check engine lights, like I said, can indicate bigger failures, especially on newer engines. Any sort of emission code, that can cost you thousands of dollars. It could be the SCR system, that's the DEF system. It could be the DPF. It might have an ART head if it's a CAT, or a variable geometry turbo that's extremely expensive. Any check engine light's a bad sign, and it needs to be looked at right away. That doesn't, of course, mean that you should not buy that engine. You should just have it checked out, because the last thing you want to do is buy it and then have it at the shop for 2 weeks and get a bill for $5,000, right? Now, what about logged or stored codes that aren't active? Well, most newer engines are going to have some sort of logged code. They have so many sensors, and they can pick up codes right away. And maybe you have one logged event from one sensor 100 engine hours ago. It's probably not a problem. But if you can see that, hey, this fault's been on and it's had 100 occurrences over the last 200 hours, it's probably going to be a recurring problem, and you'd want to have it looked at. Of course, logged faults typically aren't going to be displayed on the dash, so you'd need some sort of code reader, or better, have a dealer or someone you trust look at the engine and go from there and let them tell you what they think the problem could be. So we've talked about pretty much all the problems that can go wrong with the engine, as far as leaks, the fluids, check engine lights, performance. You also need to check that everything works. A lot of things are controlled by the engine that you may not think about, like the cruise control, or if there's an exhaust brake or a compression brake, like a Jacobs system. If you want to road test this, as I already mentioned before, if those systems aren't working, that of course can cost you a lot of money. Make sure every system works. Does AC work? Does the heater come on? Maybe it's the middle of summer. You still want to make sure the heater works. You want to see if the cruise control works. If it doesn't, that could be a big wiring problem, especially if it's something like an RV where you've got 80 feet of electrical wire and multiple different body modules and stuff that can come in conflict with each other. And a lot of the times those systems won't throw a check engine light or any sort of code displayed. They might just not work. And you want to make sure they do work. The Jacobs system or an exhaust brake, you want to make sure those kick on and they work, because those as well can be very expensive, especially on the heavier duty ones. The Jacobs systems, the housings themselves can be maybe $1,000 each, and you might have 3 of them. You can indicate a problem with the ECM or the wiring harness. You know, all these systems need to work. Does the throttle work? Does it go fully on, fully off? Of course. The brakes, everything else, that's unrelated to the engine for the most part, but the air compressor is driven by the engine, so if it's not building air, if this is an air brake setup, that's also related to the engine. You want to make sure that that system's working. The power steering pump, usually driven by the engine. Is it working? Is the power steering system working normally? These are all things you need to look at. Okay? Now, of course, I can't cover everything on every engine, but if I was looking at a diesel engine, these would be the main things that I would recommend to anyone I know to look for. And if they all check out, you've done your due diligence. Okay? Hope you enjoyed the video.